It's a real pleasure, dare I say honor, to follow up the previous panel on AI ML with our discussion on ethical framework. This will not be a do-gooder or be-gooder conversation. It's going to be a useful conversation, and it's going to draw very heavily upon your own reactions and your own situational awareness on what's going on in your organizations as it relates to AI and machine learning. My name is Michael Schrage. I'm a research fellow with the Initiative on the Digital Economy at the Sloan School, and I have three terrific panelists here that we're going to facilitate a conversation. They bring their own background and expertise on this. Kelly Combs, who's immediately to my left, is the director of KPMG's Emerging Technology Group. She's also the U.S. solution leader for intelligent automation. I assume that's RPA as well, particularly on the governance side. And governance, of course, is going to tie into ethical issues. Leigh Hafrey is with MIT Sloan School. He's been teaching here for about 30 years.
27.
I'm sorry. Close enough.
We round up.
Yeah, we're rounding up. He has specialized in ethical and philosophical issues, and in fact, I believe he's the editor of one of the editors of the Journal of Business Ethics Education. And in a previous life, he was also, with his wife, a master of Matherhouse at Harvard. Gail Evans, who I was fortunate enough to be on a panel with a couple of years back when she was with Mercer, is now, as of 3 months ago, the Chief Digital and Technology Officer for Disney, and she also works with digital products and parks, experiences, and products. So what we have here is a mix of people with service experience, technical experience, and ethical/philosophical experience on this. I do want to give you my own bias before we go to the audience, go to you and ask you questions on this. I am struck, as one looks at the roadmaps, the AI machine learning roadmaps, I am struck by what issues are novel and unique to AI, and which ones are pretty much ethics 2.0 or ethics 3.0. I think fundamental questions, as Aristotle would have it, really haven't changed very much in the ethical domain. That said, as technologies have different levels of agency and precision, as we delegate and or outsource certain kinds of, and more important kinds of decisions to them, different kind of ethical concerns emerge. I clearly believe, and will discuss, that issues associated with explainability, interpretability, and transparency, and the ethics around those are going to matter more. The notion of what does bias mean, because in a machine learning environment, statistical bias can translate into operational bias. We need to have, what kind of visibility is appropriate in that regard? I also am very, very curious about what level of deference we want to give our algorithms. I really do wonder, on both an ethical and agency term, and this is a topic I'd like to discuss, to what extent do we want to defer? In the last panel they talk about, fact-based, decision, et cetera. Yeah. But to what extent do we really want to defer to smart algorithms? Do we really want our algorithms to be our bosses, and that compliance with what sort of quote unquote smart algorithms tell us to do is going to be the determinants of our quote unquote performance? Those are the kinds of questions that I believe we're going to discuss. But just in terms of situational awareness here, we have the questions, but I would like to go back to the tech folks. Can we put up the first audience poll, please? Because that's not what I have here. I have questions. There we go. This is where I'd like to take the temperature of the people virtually and in this room. We do formal ethics audits for sample bias in the data sets we use to train algorithms in making decisions about human beings. Yes, no, don't know. How much time should we allow? 10, 15 seconds? No, I don't want the top questions. I want to go back to the poll. Irving, there we go. So my fear is that there we go. We should figure out, there are 3 people, talk about sample. You see, this is a very meta thing. It's sample bias about sample bias. We have 3 people, but 2/3 of them, now we're up to 50-50 again. Okay, all together now, what did we learn in Stats 101? Law of large numbers. Law of large numbers on this. 6 there we go, don't know. Quite honestly, my expectation was that more people would say no, or they would say they don't know, because there's a lot of disagreement about these things. So we're getting up there. Just for a show of hands in the people in this room, any of you in the data science groups? Actually, I'm going to use the prerogative of the chair. Do you guys do it? Yes. And how long have you been doing it? Could you identify yourself for? Bell.
I'm CIO for a company called Mathematica. So we do economics, stats, statistics, data science.
And they're very sophisticated on these kinds of bias, right?
Yes. And so inequity is part of our lens and our mission. So we have always sampled for bias. That doesn't mean that we have it 100% captured, because the bias can be even in the interpreter of the data.
Right.
As well as the designer of the model or the algorithm or the data already itself.
Excellent. But you do have formal processes for these.
We have governance and systems thinking about it.
Very good. Anybody else in the room? Sir.
Here with Johnson & Johnson.
Very good.
Due to the regulatory element of healthcare, there is better focus on these elements.
And are you guys beginning to explore AI/ML, or is this straightforward? Okay, very good. So is there a special focus for the machine learning side?
Yes, especially on unified healthcare and transparency across.
Very good. Well, we'll certainly bring you in on the transparency side. We have another question? Another poll question? No. No formal answers. That's interesting. Next poll question. Irving, thank you. Irving, you got to get away from those questions. Our legal team is an excellent partner. I picked the word excellent deliberately, with us in reviewing the ethical as well as legal issues associated with efforts. Show of hands here. How many of you have talked with legal on an ethical question regarding AI? One, you again. So it's always the same hands, isn't it? You know? Don't know. That would be the answer that I expect. Full disclosure, my belief is that, my Bayesian prior is that most ethical, quote unquote, concerns are outsourced to legal on this grid. We all know that legal ethics is an oxymoron, but that's life. Any comments here?
Lawyers in the room?
Sorry?
She said, any lawyers in the room?
I would hope so. Really, do you think a lawyer is going to come to an IT conference? Nah.
Well.
That's right. You send billable associates for that, you know. And yes, my brother did graduate from Harvard Law. That's not a joke. Next one. Irving, third and final poll question before we go to the conversation. Nope, still doing on the questions. Our IT and digital transformation teams have healthy and productive discussions around ethical implications of our innovations for both our customers and our colleagues. That is to say, ethics are a part of the way we discuss these things, not have we hit the milestone for delivery. You know, I'll make a joke. DevSecOps, maybe it's DevFOps. Any DevFOps in the room? You like that? Oh God, please. Okay?
I assume 5 is better. 5
Um,
is better, 1 is lower.
I tell you what, we'll say 1 is the worst, 5 is the best. Really, I'm very impressed that even for the small group. What about for you all here?
You might have selected for a group that's thinking.
We're back.
We are biased.
I was about to say, we're back to the sample bias questions here. Gee, who would have thought that people coming to an ethics thing would be interested in ethics? But just a second, that does not necessarily mean that you're having good quality conversations on this. Are you guys happy with the quality of conversations that you're having?
I think
We're starting.
this maturity curve here, but I'm happy with that the topic is top of mind for everyone around this topic in terms of how we explore the opportunities ahead. And the fact that we could do it, it doesn't mean that we should do it.
Very interesting. Well, the audience has certainly done an excellent job of contributing. Now it's time for the panel on this. Kelly, I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
On this. Is this, between the companies that you work with and the internal issues for KPMG, being a thought leader, being a convener, and being in the assurance business as well as the technology transfer implementation business, is ethics at the margins or at the core of some of the things that you deploy? We can start with either the intelligence automation solutions or governance or just emerging technologies.
And you mean ethics as a broader topic and not ethics and AI, just to clarify?
Ethics is a broader topic.
Okay.
We can go into
we'll
AI.
start there. So at KPMG, I would say we're moving it to our core. There's been a lot of more concerted efforts around culture and DEI initiatives and thinking about how do we instill ethics in the way that we work at KPMG in order to better serve our clients. Now, I'm biased in the
Right.
fact that I lead our responsible intelligent automation, responsible AI solutions, and I like to separate not separate, but sort of distinguish the concept of ethics in general, and then how do we translate that to data and technology that mimics human behavior.
So what is the most important ethical argument your organization is having right now around an AI or ML deployment or design?
The biggest challenges I see is how do we take these broad stroke ethical principles like justice, like fidelity, and how do we prove and measure through evidence and clear metrics that we're doing the things that we say that we're doing, and how do we have it focused enough in order to be able to demonstrate, again, we're doing these actions repeatably. I think the challenge we have is we talk about bias. Bias is not an ethical principle to me. Bias is something we can measure in data, in the design time of an algorithm, in the outcome. And so the challenge we're finding is how do you bridge the gap between we're an ethical organization, ethics is at our core, we use data and we use algorithms to make decisions on that data that impact internally or our consumers. How do we prove that we're doing that in a fair way?
Are you saying how do we quantitatively demonstrate that we're qualitatively ethical?
That's right. Or how do we consistently demonstrate through evidence and not through statements, through metrics we can measure throughout the development lifecycle that we're doing what we said we were going to do?
I love that phrase, ethical metrics. I assume, Leigh, that's a source of so in the teaching that you do and what's the biggest argument that you participate in or oversee or facilitate in regards to implementation?
You have to understand, all of my teaching occurs at Sloan, so
Right.
we have the broad
Bias.
business ethics overlay
Right.
on the question of ethics more broadly.
Right.
What it means to be a professional, whether business people are professionals in the same way
Right.
that attorneys are, or physicians or engineers. I mean, it raises a whole, and the question of service, which actually made its way into the conversation a little earlier, and culture. So I was interested in our participants' testimony from J&J. This is long-term culture within the organization that you have now applied to recent technological evolution, right? And I think that's important to recognize. So
But what's the big argument?
the big argument among people in the school.
in the school. When you talk with people and listen to people who are talking about how do we take advantage of these technologies, of smarter technologies in ways that do not put us on a risk-adjusted basis, of
I think
accusations.
there's real skepticism about algorithms, at least among some of us. And there are others, of course, who recognize that it's the future and we're going to have to figure out how to make the technology work for us in responsible ways. I mean, underlying that is a question that maybe doesn't get phrased this way. But so, both last night and this morning, on some of the sessions, which I followed virtually, the word trust came up again and again
Right.
and again, right? But think about it. One of the sort of stereotypical notions of what it means to do business is caveat emptor, buyer beware. So are we in a different place now because of technology and because of the burden of responsibility that our technologies are putting on us in a way that wasn't true 50 years ago? And that is a question about business ethics and whether business ethics isn't, and I put this in a book back in 2005, isn't an oxymoron. So a contradiction.
Legal ethics, business ethics. So
Well-
whatever the prefix for ethics is a tendency to oxymoronic. I like that. Gail, what's the biggest discussion? Now, you have the excuse of only having been at Disney
Why
for
might it be an excuse?
Okay.
I can't speak for Disney. I've only been there 8 weeks. But I think on the topic of ethics, I think that there's a change happening, a behavior change that's happening by, these digital native Gen Z type individuals who may feel a little differently than those 30 years ago. So in the industry, I'll use entertainment. Is there questions about how I use the data to ensure that you have the best experience that you can have? Is that an ethical problem with an AI, or would you want an algorithm to help ensure you have the best experience? So I think there's a shift happening. I wouldn't say it's far right, where there's no rules, it's just open and you do whatever, no values, no integrity, no trust.
I wouldn't say libertarian is right.
But
go on, yes.
I would think that there's a shift over the last 10 years where folks are welcoming some change, technological change in their lives.
So we'll reverse order here.
Okay.
And this is one of the questions we discussed. And actually, you're ideal to ask this question because you've only been at Disney for 8 weeks. What's the most important thing we should understand about the ethics of the culture, the value of ethics in the culture that you think is going to influence the way you approach bringing smarter algorithms and more data to the issues that you've identified?
Changes in the culture.
Clearly, Disney customer is a family organizations, and it's one of the great brands in world history.
Well, I think in general, I can't, I would be, it's too early to say I could speak about Disney's culture. But in general, I do think that families are wanting more personalization than they ever wanted before. They want to feel like you know them and be a part of their journeys in entertainment. And so I think that's a shift, that's a cultural shift, because even the smaller children who really love Cinderella, as an adult, I may want you to know that my little girl loves Cinderella. So where is that on your ethic spectrum?
You're setting the stage for a conversation I want us to have. That's very good. At MIT, at the Sloan, this discussion on professionalism, what's the most important cultural value you think is people in the audience need to understand, that we need to understand?
So I would second Gail on
Terrific.
the generational shift, and maybe that's a fair way to put it, right? That the younger students are coming in with different expectations.
No question.
And I personally find that very gratifying and satisfying and provides a lot of...
That's because you're no longer a master at Harvard.
It was actually my wife,
Wife.
FYI. I was
Apologies.
the
You
escort.
were the trailing spouse. Okay, right.
So, but just for those of you who don't spend much time at Harvard, so we had 400 undergraduates with us 9 months of the year. And they lived around us, and it was a total immersion experience and very interesting. So, and we did it for 18 years. But so where does that get us? Some of them then came to MIT and to MIT Sloan for MBAs. They did very well. I'm very proud of them, but I'm very proud of all of my MBAs. I do think there is this change in expectations that I find encouraging, that I think will lead to better business practice as we move forward, specifically in the areas where our current panel is concerned, that is technology. The digital native notion is real and has consequences. So to the extent that we navigate, and when I say we, I don't mean faculty necessarily, but
Right.
the community broadly, to the extent that we negotiate that intelligently and with ethical standards in mind, we will do it well and better. And that includes the question of bias in algorithms.
Okay.
We know it's there. How do we address it?
Kelly?
So I think I agree with, I think what Gail was alluding to earlier is because we have the data and we can do personalization and people are okay with that, is that really an ethical question? Is it more of an individual preference, or is it a broader ethical question of how we use that data and where personalization comes into play? So I think in the same vein of, in agreement of, we have this heightened culture of awareness of, I like when the experience is catered to the things that I want to see and my interests, but we're also sort of converging with awareness about how those algorithms work and what are the implications of them. And we've now raised the bar, the standards to say when those decisions used to happen in rooms with people, we didn't have all of the transparency and the data around how those decisions were made. And now, in a lot of ways, we do. And so we want more transparency and explainability as to why that personalization happened or why that judgment was made about me. So I feel like what's happening is we now are more in tune with how the data is being used when an algorithm's making the decision versus a human. And so there's higher questions, and sort of the responsibility level of an organization has been elevated than maybe before when it was human-based. Because we've sort of, how we use data and how decisions were made, we maybe didn't have all of the transparency and the data around what data attribute contributed to the outcome before, because there were people making those decisions on paper.
I agree with you, Kelly. I think it's about impact. The decision the algorithms make, are there individuals or segments or cohorts of people that will be impacted on, and how deeply are they impacted? Are they left out? And people want to know, are they left out? What segment are they in? Did it exclude me? And if it did exclude me, why? Especially if that algorithm is to support, urban cities. How are you deciding on who gets that benefit or not?
Well, I want to double down on your comment about personalization in cohorts, because with apologies to the gentleman from J&J here, the thing that I would suggest integrates the points that the three of you have just made is what the medical community has been dealing with for hundreds of years, which is informed consent. And as we have orders of magnitude more data and ever smarter ensembles of algorithms, we're back to interpretability, transparency, and explainability, but what constitutes informed consent? I can completely understand, and you're in Florida, and I'm not saying this is a political point, but the whole notion of you as a parent are happy to have your child exposed to Cinderella. You know, other parents may not want fantasy. They do not provide consent. When you tell them, no, we want to avoid that kind of conversation. We don't want to have the Santa Claus conversation on this. So I think one of the questions I'm going to ask you all is, do you believe your organizations address, we're back to the legal point, with, releases. Do you believe that, does Disney, when you begin to explore different kinds of recommendations, different kinds of offerings, different kinds of personalization-based offerings, how do you believe we should have conversations about what informed consent should mean? Is this something that's going to be focused grouped? Is this something that's going to be lawyered? Or is this the kind of thing where, in fact, Disney is diverse enough, KPMG is diverse enough, that as people, we can give you remarkable insight as to what we consider to be appropriate information for appropriate consent?
Informed consent.
Now, in your Mercer incarnation, this would be a completely fair comment to make, because the workforce initiation, improvement, Mercer definitely wanted to engage people and inform them and get them to assent and consent on this. Feel free to pivot with whatever organization you're more.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll speak on to Mercer, because Disney has, I don't feel very comfortable with that. Only in that, in my 8 weeks, I don't think I have the depth of experience on all the things that are happening, and I don't want to misspeak and leave anything out. So I guess I want to be an informed speaker.
Fair enough.
So
I'll consent to that.
So I do think that in Mercer, there was a number of focus groups and getting information about a topic from our clients, from our even our colleagues, right? Because our colleagues are both the consumer and a colleague. We tend to leave them out, but there's good insight into focus groups and surveys to help you with informed consent. But it's not 100%, right? It's not, there's bias even in that, right? Because there's a diverse group of people, how I was raised, where I was raised, my parents, they all have play a factor in my life and in my decisions. And so I don't believe every person, has their own uniqueness about them. And how do you capture that? You can generalize it. You can say, oh, you belong in this cohort because you're African American, you were born in the inner city, so you belong over here. But if I'm, black, I am black, and I was born in the suburbs, I may not be in the same cohort. But my family values may be the same. How do you handle those situations? So I think data gets you maybe 60, 70% there, but there's something else. And maybe you can help me with what that something else is. But it doesn't get you 100% there, and which is why...
But let's be blunt. Can you get 100% there?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. I think ethics, almost by definition, is about trade-offs on this. We are not. So this is the thing. I wasn't expecting to say this, but I want to drill down. In the advisory work that I'm doing, just so you know, wrote a book on recommender systems, et cetera. The organizations that are data-driven their indifference curve, their split is, do we get a better return on data personalizing something or segmenting? Mm-hmm. Putting them in a cohort group or better personalized. You're nodding because I would imagine the issue is not unique to me. I don't know. to me, the way to ethically resolve the issue is so long as you let people know and give them an opt-out or opt-in provision, that's good enough. Because I can imagine some people being offended that I put them in a cohort versus being offended because I've become even more invasive in personalizing something to them. So my background is economics. You're not going to have 100%. Given that you can't have 100%, how do we assess the trade-offs? That's what I want to know. How did you assess the one thing we know for sure, we're going to have smarter algorithms, we're going to have more data. How do we have a better way of articulating the trade-offs we are or are not prepared to make? I'll go with you on this one Kelly. Just one hypothetical. Here you are, you're doing intelligent automation. I could argue that one of the ethical considerations when you roll out intelligent automation is that you're causing a certain amount of unemployment in that regard. That in fact you're not we're back to the 1930s and the automation obsolescence kind of issue. How do you deal with those kinds of concerns in this regard?
Yeah, so a couple of things that I'm thinking about. So, one, I used to work with a data aggregator that sells their data to a lot of large organizations, and they have 1,300 behavioral attributes about every consumer in the US at an individual level. And I think there's just a lot of individuals, when we talk about informed consent, are maybe not, they may opt in for one purpose, but may not realize, the magnitude of the data or how that data may be repurposed after that initial consent. So I think it's surprising to people that there's an algorithm that makes a decision about your credit worthiness that's using your Marriott loyalty points, yada, yada. Right. So I feel like when we get to informed consent, I think there's a difference between our organizations doing it, and the answer is yes, and how do they think about that ethically? They may not be yet. I'm not speaking on behalf of the organizations here, especially in healthcare. I work a lot in financial services. I think they've made the trade-off in terms of we're seeing a higher level of accuracy and performance,
so
right, in the products that we're selling.
Let's not interfere with it.
And now we're seeing regulation, in the absence of prescriptive AI regulation, is anchoring on data privacy, right? So yes, in certain circumstances, there's certain requirements around certain protected attributes you can't use. It doesn't mean they're not using a proxy for that attribute. So when you ask the cost benefit, or what are organizations practically doing, what I'm seeing is we're already there, we're already using it, we've already seen benefit. And again, maybe we've gone from 65% accuracy when we did it on paper with people, and now with this optimized model, we're seeing 80% accuracy of conversion rate. Now it's sort of the implications of let's now understand what data we're using. Are there proxies for data we shouldn't be using? And are we ethically okay with the purposes of that data in this domain, in this context? And how do we put guardrails around that?
You are hearing those conversations.
I am, yeah. And again, it's
who leads them?
Not the data science group. It's typically, well, from my experience, it depends, right? There could be a head of data science. A lot of it's still driven by...
Should the data science group be leading it, since they're the ones introducing the higher degree of precision, accuracy, et cetera?
It's usually the functional area asking questions, or a legal, a compliance. And a lot of times it's, again, how do we bridge the gap between the pure data science and how do we optimize that model? And we believe we can pull this data because it's from an enterprise data lake for the purposes of AI, but that may have not been the intended purpose of that data set. So it's how do we create a risk-based approach, specific validations and metrics to occur that I mentioned earlier as part of ML ops to validate at certain points in design time that we're checking for.
I want to go to a curious question, but you've raised something that I think is brilliant. And so I just want to ask all three of you this question. You talked about the unexpected value that you can get from the improvements in these models, and how do we incorporate a risk-based approach? Here's the question I'd like to ask you all. This is sort of a devil or deep blue sea sort of question. Should we simply incorporate ethical risk under a risk-based approach? ethics is just one of the factors that you have to deal with. So let's put the risk factor and the ethics factor in the risk-based model. And that way we can demonstrate that look, we have a risk model and we can debate about how much we weight ethics in the risk model, but that way we can, according to the very values you champion, that we can demonstrate that we're incorporating ethics and making ethics part of the value trade-off for this dramatic improvement in our model predictive.
I would separate the ethics from responsible AI. I think you have ethical principles that serve as a code of conduct, a moral compass for the organization. I think those principles are too generalized, are too broad, are too theoretical, that then we try to take those and say, okay, we want to do what's right. Okay, but we have to measure that in data and technology that mimics human behavior but isn't human in nature.
Right.
And we have to create things we can actually measure, right? So to me, we talk about moral compasses.
But that's why it's a risk-based model.
I don't think we call them ethics metrics. I think we got to be really careful about that.
Why not?
I think there are
We
metrics
call it ethics metrics.
that we have
Yeah,
that tie back to our ethical principles.
Why can't we call them ethics metrics? We quantify everything here. Why don't we?
What is an ethics risk factor? Really?
So Leigh in an earlier life also worked at the New York Times. And one of the ethical guidelines that public service officials were, remember the famous line? Would you want this appearing on the front page of the New York Times? That's a nice, ethical, very clear statement. Yes, no, not on the front page, in the back page, page 3, okay? So that's why I'm
the risk factor.
I would say that would be a risk. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
But when you say ethics risk factor, I hear it as data.
that's exactly what we're trying to do.
No, but I think that you're actually arguing you can't digitize that. And that's the 30% that you're still looking for once you've gotten 60 to 70% certainty based on your data. And I don't want to start championing uncertainty here, but we at least have to recognize that it has value under certain circumstances. I also heard, coming out of what you were saying, Kelly, the idea that you need to work across functions and across areas. So there was a panel this morning, collaboration amongst all the acronyms.
It was the most politically correct panel we heard today. Yes.
Well, but so I have
People
to
should collaborate successfully.
So, George, yes. So, really?
Yes.
You have a problem with that?
The cliche, yes. The spirit, no.
So I thought, George Corwin said, marketing, they need to pay attention to what other functions are doing.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you call it intersectionality, call it interfunctionality, and it applies broadly to ethics. It's not just about business and society, it's business talking with. So private sector talking with the public sector, talking with the civil sector, and that's how you get the remaining 30%. It's negotiated, it's a common sense.
Yeah, I mean, I like that. It's always, at Mercer, it was a cross-functional team. There was marketing, there was legal, there's technologists, there's data scientists. We weren't trying to get to a weighted number, but the value of the dialogue and coming together as a team and looking at all the dimensions is a start. It's a start. And then you evolve and you continuously improve. You collect data and you continuously improve it.
So here's my problem with this. My background in machine learning and AI is such that it does come down to a weighted number. These are Bayesian nets. They're weights. They're priors. They're posteriors. You update these things. You have ensembles. The models are weighted.
Factor we can't define.
Exactly right. That's why that's the problem. And if Kelly is trying to demonstrate to people that we're, this AI, this model that we're doing gives us better results, we have to accept that, quote unquote, violation of privacy or issues associated, that has to be weighed in there. I'll just to be really tough on this. Everybody in this room is familiar with the acronym DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay? We don't have a poll here, so don't worry. But if I asked you in your organization, how should those 3 variables be weighted in performance management and promotion, do we honestly believe that the majority of people would weight diversity, equity, and inclusion the same? No, some people would privilege inclusion over diversity. Some people would privilege equity over diversity and inclusion. This is exactly what you're saying, Leigh. These things are going to be negotiated. So the billion-dollar question is, how do you ethically negotiate those trade-offs? Because here's the thing with AI/ML. You can take the data and it'll optimize around those things because of the weights that it has.
That's right.
So that's why we want transparency. And so that's the question. How do we ethically draw the lines or articulate why we weight these values over those values? That's what I'm looking for here. Because how those values are weighted.
I'm ready to be a millionaire, because once that's solved, I'm sure I can.
No,
No,
the problem, here's my pushback on that, Gail. My view is it's not that you're going to be a millionaire because you solve the problem. You're going to be a millionaire because you enable Disney to articulate how it wants to weight the machine learning capabilities you bring to the organization. That for these kinds of families, we're going to personalize along this dimension. For those kinds of families, we're going to personalize along these dimensions in an informed consent, transparent way. That would be my bet on this. Please.
I don't work for Disney. Can I speak about Disney just briefly? I mean, Disney is synonymous with a huge chunk of American culture for much of the 20th century.
legacy.
And you would have to mine that history in order to understand how you might weight DE.
That's why God created GPT-3. Nobody laughs at that? That's why God created Gito? GTO?
No.
You people should be Googling GPT-3 and Gito. Sorry on this. Okay.
So anyway, I think, the history is huge, and it's a significant factor.
And it's diverse, and it's not. I mean, everything that you've said, Michael, makes sense.
But
you got to operationalize that, and that's where. And these are folks that have 25-year history. Many of them aren't digital natives, so it sounds like a great academic exercise.
ouch.
However,
Ouch.
much love for you, though, Michael.
Ouch.
But very hard to execute. But I will say that at the core of Disney is to have that ethic, value, trust, for all of our guests and consumers. And that's number one. That is first.
Right.
And it is embedded in everything we do. But to say I can get to a number that represents that, I would love to do that academic exercise.
I'm going to bet that for certain things you will be doing that. But I want to. But we'll go with Kelly, and then we'll go to the audience here. I think actually that's what you're going to be asked to do by a lot of your clients. If we do this kind of personalization, what risk does it put it at? What is a cost benefit on this?
I agree with Gail. I think that's the desired state, but I think there's a lot of challenges to getting there, and part of it's the data is decentralized, the development work's decentralized, lines of business own their development capabilities. They have different performance metrics and ways that they measure success with AI. And so, what I'm seeing is, let's start with centralizing the technology capabilities. Let's build a workbench and build the workflow for the process.
Right.
And then let's go back to that, what is at our core, and what do we think is right, and how do we make decisions, and let's instill those concepts, and then try to, by persona, by stakeholder, cross-functionally, define the metrics that we can measure that tie back to those. But that, I mean, again, this is at a small level. This is like for the highest risk models or that have the highest impact to our reputation, we start there.
So
I think it's a process, Kelly.
What you're saying
I
is
do.
where everyone would like to be,
No.
but to get there, I mean, the cost of doing that type of governance versus the speed to deliver on the value.
It's a North Star, Michael.
My last question, I'm just thinking of organizations that I work with, and I'm not going to give the name, but I know not one, but two organizations that are using a variety of AI, ML techniques, not, as good as Google, but they're pretty good. They work with Carnegie Mellon and Stanford and MIT graduates. And the way I'm picking my word, not theirs, the way they're cheating this is they're looking for correlations between their AI ML process, customer touch, customer experience, and boosts in, don't hiss, net promoter score.
Yeah.
Okay? So their view is, if we're boosted, how can it be unethical if the numbers are going up for people willing to be champions for us? Now, do they have the most transparent and explainable ML, machine learning? No. But if the numbers don't go up, it's not worth it. If the numbers go down, abandon ship. But if the numbers going up, they literally say, I was in the room, we must be doing something right. Because the net promoter scores are going up on this. That's why we're doing this with the best of intention. We can't explain the details why, but that's their effort to improve the customer experience. I hope that what I've said, that is not completely inconsistent with your experience of how people are doing this.
The organizations I work with frame it more as we have a good understanding and we track the models that we believe pose the highest financial risk, reputational risk, so maybe not just net promoter score, but
Right.
or are likely to be highly regulated, so we need to have a good explanation. But for everything else, we don't have an answer. Like it's not the
Very
Wild West, but we're willing to allow.
But that's a very disciplined answer.
Yeah.
Are there questions or comments in regards to this? I really liked your comment, Akira, on that digitally natives, the youngers, don't necessarily understand informed consent. So I kind of like the fact that it's unethical to bring informed consent to people because they're...
Think about it, how many of us sign a EULA every day?
Exactly.
And never read it.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Linda, most of us do not understand the implications, nor the consequences, nor the value.
But that's because it's written by lawyers. That's not a joke. It is written by lawyers.
It's written by lawyers, but we don't understand the value nor the impact and consequences of what we give away every day.
I can't disagree with that. So your view is informed consent is the wrong horse to bet on going forward.
I think it's
Wow. Which horse would you bet on or breed?
that's why you guys are up there. I'm here to learn. But I mean, to the young folks,
Yeah.
they are starting to pay attention to value generation. So more of them are starting to,
You mean like being influencers?
yeah, like that, to make sure that they're earning on their ability. Because they all love the network effect of putting in. Now they're starting to understand the value side of it. Why can't I get some of that value? Now, if only they can understand the other implication pieces. I have two college students, and I keep saying, don't put anything out there that you wouldn't want said in Central Park. Or just given away.
Not the New York Times. Notice that. Central Park. Okay. Yes.
Just given away.
Right. By the way, do they follow your advice?
They were pretty good.
Okay.
Pretty good. They weren't always. They were good. But they also know I watch.
So, but
They might have seen
but I have a question for you. You said they're beginning to understand the value of their role online, and I hear that as earning capacity. Is that correct?
I think that's the way that they're starting to show it, is through that way. But I don't think they understand it in social arenas as influencers and content creators and things of that nature stuff now. I don't think they understand it in other ecosystems.
Well, so I want to keep this really simple, but they understand value, or they're coming to understand the value. What about the values, plural?
That I don't think, at least going by my kids' peers.
Yeah.
No.
And do we know what those values are?
We're divided on that as well, as adults. As fully formed middle-aged people.
But that's why I think
We have a, I don't, and that's the thing is, like,
Ethical
you
a-
talk about a risk tolerance score.
exactly.
I don't think you could get to a right answer.
Hold on a second. I don't think you can get to a right answer.
So even if there is a right answer, I don't think we all know what the right answer is, and it might be changing and fluid depending on the moment, the circumstance, so.
We call that situational ethics, is what it's, you know.
Sometimes you know, you need certain data to be unbiased, and sometimes you want the information in there. Depends on the problem I'm trying to solve.
Based on this exchange, and again, looking for comments here, based on this exchange, I would abandon the ethical design issue in favor of better transparency, better explainability, better interpretability, so you create community awareness. Sorry? I'm trying to be as clear and stark as possible on this, because what you're saying, how can you want me to both agree and disagree with you. It's, there's no right answer. So you have to,
So we're identifying our digital trust program as having like 5 pillars. One of them is transparency on all of the other 4 pillars. One of them is ethical use, one of them is privacy, one of them
you've just told me that ethical use can't be defined.
I don't think it's easy to define, and I don't think you can get everybody to agree on one answer to that.
Right.
Or it wasn't even the one answer to ethics, it's that tolerance number.
Factor, the risk
That's
factor.
That's the thing I don't think you can get everybody to agree on. I think, you know, you made the point that there's the business ethics statement, you can get everybody to agree on that. That metric, not so much. We want to do no harm, we want to create equitable outcomes, we want to respect privacy, we don't want to.
Right. Remember, Google used to be "don't be evil," and they abandoned that. You know, that's not a joke.
It's true.
Other comments? Well, I want to just pick on the J&J person for a moment. To what extent do you believe that ethical questions are going to basically be subsumed or taken over by the way regulators choose to define things in law, that ultimately ethical norms become legal standards in some way? So long as you treat the law, comply with the law, yes, I'm setting you up there, Leigh. So long as you comply with the law, you're safe. You don't have to worry as much on the ethical aspect of these things.
I think that the regulators are searching for industry to help understand what that is going to be. I don't think that it's going to be a top-down approach. It's definitely a conversation back and forward. And the good news is that everyone is trying to do the right thing. What is that right thing may vary a lot, but I think they're eager to learn as much as we're eager to partner with them to understand where those barriers are going to be. The other thing I would say is that bias and ethics is something that happens right now in the
Right.
analog world.
All the time.
Big time. Right? So if you think about healthcare inequality, it's so prevalent right now, even here in the US. Right? So is technology actually even putting that worse, or it's actually creating transparency for that inequality
To
exists
clarify
today?
it, right.
And helps us to get into a better healthcare system across the globe. So I do think that the future is actually more bright than the challenges associated with it, but there's going to be a lot of concerns that the panelists identify that needs to be addressed.
I would like you to address the compliance issue that we discussed.
Yeah, well, so I'm happy to do that, but I wanted to add one more T to your list of T's, and that is totality. Biased or unbiased, I think a real concern for a lot of people at this point is how much data the tech companies, but more broadly, right, companies that don't necessarily designate themselves as such, how much data they have on us. and what that allows them to do, right? And there's been a lot of powerful writing on this by academics, but still people who know what's going on. And I think we need to worry about that. And that is an ethical question, right? So, and it speaks,
Agreed.
I think I hear, Michael, in some of your questions, an economist's bias on a lot of the issues that we're raising. And
Yes.
that's why a comment on value, but not on values you let pass. But I'm sorry, you have to address this.
I did read Theory of Moral Sentiments, not just Wealth of Nations.
Well, that's a start.
Just so you know.
It's a start.
And just add some
Please.
mentality that I think is brilliant. It's also different regulators around the world sees totality in a very different way. So if you,
Yeah.
if you think about, not putting anyone on the spot, but just think about three different, completely different things and systems. European community, China, and US, and how these three major governmental areas would look at totality in a completely different way. So I do think that that's going to actually differentiate enormously how much access people will have to data in the future, and how these totality numbers will shape the future of how AI will work in the future.
I like it, from totality to totalitarian. But I would like your comment on compliance, because you were very passionate about that issue.
Compliance isn't enough. And actually, this goes back 3 or 4 minutes in our conversation, but you know, there's this, I think, age-old distinction between the letter and the spirit of the law. And again, to your 30% from early on, I think that's the spirit. And how do we negotiate that spirit? So how do we live up to the intent, even if inadequately phrased for legal purposes, and not simply say, this is the minimum, and it's about penalties rather than inspiration. I think we need to worry about that.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So,
For sure. We have, who here has hired a chief philosopher, right? We would presume to have this panel on ethics, which anyone who has a PhD knows that you are a doctor of philosophy, the mother discipline, the discipline that has ethics in it. And we would say to our children, don't lie. It's wrong to lie. And then they get a little bit older, and we say, well, lying, if you're going to save a life, that's okay. Or lying if your sweetheart says, do I look good in this? Is actually a good idea. Right, so to pretend that
Pragmatist, sorry.
no, I mean, well, yeah. But to pretend that we could reduce something to a number, right? Like the kinds of things we're talking about, when we have, as humans, such a tenuous grip on what we mean when we say the word ethics. I think we need to start at a place where the human beings involved in these processes have some awareness of the fact that when the iPhone first released facial recognition, didn't work if you were African American.
That's right.
Now, why is that? Just didn't think about it. Didn't think about it. Didn't occur because they weren't in the room. That is an ethical problem. It's a human ethical problem. And so to say we could reduce this to a number, I think is dramatically missing.
I could make I don't disagree with the word, only one word I disagree with. I think you could elevate things to a number. I think you're selling numbers short, pun intended, on this. The future of AI, is going to be ever more, the curse of dimensionality, ever more sophisticated manipulation of numbers that we don't understand, which is why we need more transparency, explainability, and interpretability.
Manipulation happens by humans who collect data and then decide what the parameters are. So the people deciding what the parameters are should be trained in ethics. They should take philosophy classes, and they should have a chief philosopher on staff.
So that's a good. So when will there be? MIT has multiple chief philosophers. What about KPMG?
Not that I'm aware of, but again, we've got. I'm sure somebody is there, but not that I'm privy.
What about for Disney or Mercer? You know, were you happy?
I do not know if there's a
Yeah.
So
philosopher.
we're coming to the end here, but it is very, very clear, and it's sort of interesting on this. I think there's going to be a split. I think there are going to be some organizations that are going to double down on what ethics can and should mean and how we model and measure them. I think there are other organizations that are basically going to say, these questions are too hard for, yes, we're going to honor the law and respect values, but if we're going to effectively embrace and get value from AI ML systems, we need to protect ourselves by making them as transparent, accessible, interpretable, and explainable as possible, and make sure that they're reviewed by a greater variety of people precisely so we can avoid idiotic discrimination, counterproductive discrimination on this. I think there's going to be a real, pun intended, ethical split around how organizations use these technologies.
I think that's sweet that you think that, but there's,
I think the phrase is pretty to think so.
what?
Isn't it pretty to think so, not sweet? Okay.
I mean, nothing's going to change until, you know, you have the BP oil spill, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this is what companies
Yeah.
respond to. There's going to be some spectacular failure, like, you can't open the iPhone unless you're a middle-aged white guy. And then there will be some backlash, and then they'll say, oh, we need to correct this because,
But
and, you know,
there's been quite a few of those that, and there hasn't been any major ripple that made commerce as a whole stop and say, well, now we gotta do it differently.
Right.
I mean, you have, you know, even Apple got hit again with their credit card that was discriminating against women. They clearly haven't learned yet.
but
I-
then you can open the iPhone. Then,
No,
right,
it's
so
it's more a
it's like
reactive
this
fix, but it's
spectacular
not
failure.
necessarily a systemic or an institutionalized fix. I don't know that
Yes,
that's there
yes.
yet. I would love to see when that happens.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that we've effectively solved the issue today on this. I just want to thank the panel. I want to thank you. This was a very interesting. I actually learned way more than I expected on this, and I particularly enjoyed how much we disagreed on the most important philosophical questions here. Thank you very much, and best to the panel.